What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Josh Schrei. Josh is the founder of the Emerald Podcast, which combines evocative narrative, soul-stirring music, and interviews with award-winning authors and luminaries to explore the human experience through a vibrant lens of myth, story, and imagination. I asked Josh on the podcast to talk about the subject of his episode, So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in the Age of Mythic Powers, about the rise of artificial intelligence. According to Josh, we are entering an era whose only corollary is the stuff of fairy tales and myths. Powers that used to be reserved for magicians and sorcerers, the power to access volumes of knowledge instantaneously, to create fully realized, illusory other worlds, to deceive, to conjure, to transport, to materialize on a massive scale. These powers are no longer hypothetical. They are no longer metaphorical. The mythic powers are real, and it's not clear that humanity has the tools and initiatory frameworks to use them responsibly. What's at stake is our civilization, something that was obvious to the creators of the atom bomb in 1945, but which seems far less salient today, even though the risks of societal collapse stemming from the uncontrolled proliferation of AI and its associated technologies is arguably much greater. In the first hour, Josh and I discussed the allegory of the sorcerer's apprentice and why he thinks it's an appropriate story for helping us understand the situation humanity finds itself in today. We discuss the role of magic, the desire for animacy, the burden of the Anthropocene, and why we keep gravitating towards powers that might kill us. In the second hour, we examine what life in a post-scientific era could be like, whether mass hysteria and a collective unmooring from reality are symptoms of the AI moment, and whether what we are living through today is really a spiritual crisis that cannot be solved through technological innovation, medication, or the endless pacification of media and entertainment. If you want access to that part of the conversation, and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now, by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this wonderfully enlightening and real conversation with my guest, Joshua Schrei. Joshua Schrei, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So are we going to do this conversation, Josh, in your normal voice or in your Emerald Podcast voice?
Actually, they're starting to merge into one voice, I think. I think my Emerald voice has become my normal voice. And sometimes people will be like, wait, I know that voice. Where do I know that voice from? And that's kind of a funny thing to have happen.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on, Josh. You do such creative work. It really is. I mean, you're an artist, and it's a beautiful. You synthesize artistry with philosophy and current affairs, because it is also in many ways a current affairs podcast. So I know how much you love talking about your bio. So we're going to talk about that for just a few minutes, and then we'll get into the topic of today's conversation, which is more generally your podcast, the topics you cover. We'll have an opportunity to maybe pull in a lot of different themes, but the primary sort of focus of this podcast is an episode that you did called So You Want to Be a Sorcerer in an Age of Mythic Powers. And it's an episode on AI and this moment in artificial intelligence. But before we get there, what is your deal? You have a really, really interesting background. So how would you sort of go about explaining to listeners who you are and where you came from?
I ask myself that all the time. What is your deal? What is your deal, man? I started the Emerald podcast after a lifetime of mythic study and exploration, and I was raised in a family that practiced Zen Buddhism, and so I was raised really steeped in mythic culture, and then we moved to India when I was very young. Well, early adolescence, when I was about 13 years old, we moved to India, and that was another deep mythic dive that really kind of set the tone for my life. But my bio is pretty unconventional. I didn't follow the conventional scholarly route, and I think that's part of really what gives the Emerald some resonance, is that when I looked around and saw the way that myths and stories were being dealt with, a lot of it was really abstract and analytical. And some of the spark of myth and story had been lost. And really what, for me has always been something incredibly experiential, and I think for our ancestors was incredibly experiential too, had been reduced to the world of metaphor and representation. And so really I seek to bring back what you could call the living spark of myth and story, to understand that these things aren't dead relics of the past, but they continue to unfold within us. And, as the episode that you mentioned deeply goes into, mythic narratives are alive and well in the world and are shaping a lot of the way things transpire in the modern world. So my personal experience as a practitioner of spiritual tradition, a traveler, a student, a seeker, is really what inspires the podcast and the heart of where it's coming from.
Yeah, I feel like it's clear that you grew up in a way that's unfamiliar to most people, myself included. And I'm curious to understand a little bit more of what that was like. So your parents were what, like seekers? How would you describe them? And you grew up in what? Like, is it fair to describe it as something like a commune? And where did you say it was? Was it in Arizona?
Yeah, so my parents started out as hippies and then converted to Zen Buddhism. And, the word commune kind of conjures up some hippie images, and it wasn't really like that. Zen Buddhism is a very serious practice discipline. And so by that time, my parents had kind of changed from hippies into what you could call serious spiritual practitioners. And the Zen Buddhist community, it started out in upstate New York, and then it moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So Arizona, you were probably remembering me say something about New Mexico. But it was an environment of what you could call like serious spiritual study and practice. There was constantly meditation and chanting going on. There was a real communal vibe and communal meals and communal prayer services and this kind of thing. But it wasn't probably your typical image of a commune. It was much more of kind of a dedicated practice environment. And within that, my bedtime stories were the Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's incarnations in various animal form. And my bedtime stories were also Zen koans, these unanswerable riddles that are practiced upon. And so it's interesting because I think, a lot of the adults there may not have really absorbed much of that kind of deeply embedded, what you could call animism in the tradition. But for a child, all the stories of spirits and hungry ghosts and talking animals and this type of thing really, I think, made their way in and shaped how I see the world and continue to see the world.
One of the things I'm interested in understanding is how you related to other people your age at that time growing up, and specifically people like me who sort of grew up normal, let's say, just to use that term, and people who maybe grew up like you, but in sort of monotheistic communities, like Christian communities, ultra-Orthodox communities. Is there some sort of way to draw out a distinction there?
Yeah, well, we had our little clique of Zen Buddhist kids, so it was a pretty big community. It was like one of the first Zen Buddhist communities in the States outside of Japan, and it drew a lot of practitioners at that time. So there was like a kind of, Zen clique, Dharma brats, we called ourselves, And then, yeah, we had this larger interface with the world at large. So I went to a school where not all the kids were Zen Buddhist kids, and there were interesting interactions and humorous anecdotes that arose from that. I mean, at that time, one of the biggest striking things was vegetarianism, because I was raised vegetarian, and in upstate New York in the, late 1970s, like vegetarianism was not practiced very often. So sleepovers at friends' houses became an exercise in trying to explain, universal kindness towards animals and this kind of thing to East Coast parents in the late 1970s. So there was that kind of interesting dynamic. And there were interesting conversations. I remember a Jewish friend of mine coming over, and I proceeded to get in this big conversation with him. This is probably like 9 years old or something like that. This big conversation about how like an understanding of reincarnation was a vastly superior understanding to the understanding of just one lifetime and then, one afterlife. And so like, philosophical inquiry, partially probably because I had to explain it and defend it so much as a kid, was kind of built into who I am. Like I had to explain my larger philosophy of life and the way that my family saw the world to other kids like fairly often. And, I haven't really thought about that before until you asked me this question, but I think that probably shaped a lot of, why I'm so comfortable talking in, philosophical, spiritual terms, because I've had to do it for, since I was about 5 years old, probably.
One of our recent guests, Megan O'Giblin, talked about her experience growing up in a religious evangelical community. And she described it in really wonderful terms, which I think a lot of people, when they first hear that, they might assume that growing up like that is actually not pleasant. But in fact, her experience is one that I've heard recounted from others as well. Do you find that, and I promise I'm almost done with these personal questions
again.
It's fine. I know how much you love them. So how did you find that you and those like you who grew up in the way that you did were better behaved, more grounded in school? And also, have you found that, or not? And how have you found that people like you, is there something common about people that grew up like you, kids that grew up like you, in terms of your life choices, the way you are as adults versus the rest of the population?
Yeah, I don't know so much about comparison to the larger population. I think one of the things you're getting at is interesting. In the courses I teach, I've had a few recovering Mormons, you could say, taking those courses. And it's interesting to hear them speak about the background, because the communal aspects of the backgrounds, the ritual aspects of their backgrounds, all of these are spoken of in incredibly positive terms. At a certain point, these folks, I think, had some issues with the larger ideology. But I think when we like blanketly assume in kind of, modern liberal culture that like a religious background means something, awful or like, not the way it's supposed to be, we have to remember that people have self-organized around like small cultures, small communities, and shared belief and shared ritual activity for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's a reason why humans have organized this way. And I think it provides an incredible support and stability for human beings. And I think, I actually think it's necessary in some ways. It doesn't have to be religion at the center of it necessarily, but I think in a day and age where people are suffering like fracture and isolation, I think we're actually called to look at how can there be more like of a communal infrastructure of shared ritual and shared belief for our kids. So for kids that I know who were raised like in what I would call functional spiritual communities, because it's a whole different story for kids who were raised in like chaotic spiritual communities in which there was stuff like, guru abuse going on and stuff like that. But for kids who are raised in what I would call functional spiritual communities, I see a whole lot of benefit from that. And one of the primary benefits I see, and this is a whole other rabbit hole that we probably don't have time to go down, but one of the primary benefits I see is in the pressure that it takes off the parents, because when there's an entire community raising a child, the parents aren't the absolute focal point. And like if a kid is going through something, they don't have to work it all out with their parents. They could talk to one of their communal uncles or aunties and work it out that way. And that village model of raising children, I think, is like the natural way to raise children. And I think the modern family suffers a whole lot of stress and pressure because we've lost that. And I see that now raising kids myself. It's like, we need support around us. And I think that in many ways, humans, I think, are coming back to, or trying to recreate a vision of how we raised kids and how we navigated these types of things for hundreds of thousands of years. I think we're recognizing that it's more and more necessary.
Yeah, it sounds like a more stable way to grow up, not having to rely just on your immediate nuclear family. Things can happen to your family. A lot of times kids deal with a lot of anxiety around something happening to mom and dad. And when you're part of a larger community, you feel safer. There are more people there that love you. You feel loved. You have a place. And so I think that makes sense to me. Do you think that we're living through a kind of spiritual awakening right now?
Well, I think we're living through a spiritual crisis right now. I think that, you may have heard other authors and speakers talk about what's sometimes called the meaning crisis. And, the old promise of the archaic religious institutions of Europe, for example, was rejected. And it was rejected for good reasons. It was rejected because those institutions were corrupt. And then what took its place was, humanism, rationalism, the idea of the individual can make it on their own, individual freedom, which leads to kind of the vision of the free market, and the free market is going to take care of everything and this type of thing. And I think now we see that those promises are failing too. So we've rejected what you could call like the religious life in favor of the individualist secular life. And now we're finding that there are vast problems with the anthropocentric vision of reality in which the individual is like an isolated unit out on their own trying to make it. And that puts an enormous burden and pressure on people's psychology and all of these things. So I think we're in the midst of a spiritual crisis in that fundamental questions of who we are, how we interrelate with the world around us, how we interrelate with the planet, how we interrelate with community, and what our, ultimate vision of what we're here for and what the cosmos is all about are being questioned. All of these things are being questioned. And I see this every day. I see it in the courses I teach. People are longing for some type of grounding and anchor to help navigate what are chaotic, unpredictable, often depressing times. So I think we're in the midst of a spiritual crisis. And within that, the opportunity for, I think what you're calling awakening, I think the opportunity is there within the human being with each breath that we take. I think it's there when people break bread with each other. I think it's there when we find commonality and see the humanity in the other. I think that opportunity for awakening is always there. And what you could call the friction of modernity reaches like kind of a boiling point, then I guess you could say that there's, in a way, more opportunity for that type of awakening because it challenges us. It shakes us to our core, what's going on in the world these days. And when it shakes us, there are differing ways that we can respond. And some might retreat into their deeply held beliefs and into their, little kind of holes of the way they've always seen it. And then others might be called to let go of some of the barriers between themselves and others and approach things with more heart and see the humanity in all of us. So I think that, there's a crisis and there's an opportunity for awakening. I don't tend to see things in terms of like collective global awakening, like the way that New Age spiritualities might talk about it. Like all of a sudden somebody's going to snap their fingers and everyone's going to be somehow like spiritually on the same page and ascend together.
It's not a rapture.
Yeah, I don't see it necessarily like that. But I see that, when we understand that the narratives that we've been fed aren't quite doing it, and we realize like I have to find a way to navigate this, and the only way that I know how to navigate it is from my heart, and I have to return inward. And then from returning inward, look at the nature of all of my interconnections and relationships. That's, yes, a spiritual awakening. You can definitely call it that.
So a lot of these themes are present throughout your work, including the specific episode that inspired me to have you on the podcast today, which is, as I mentioned, the title of the episode is So you want to be a sorcerer in the age of mythic powers. The allegory of the sorcerer's apprentice is, that's intimated by the title. Why did you choose this story? Tell people also what it is for people that don't know. And why did you choose this story for your AI episode?
The story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice is a story that some of you may have, well, they did a remake a few years ago, and then it was also in Disney's Fantasia in the 50s, I think that came out. So it's a pretty well-known story, and it has roots that actually go all the way back to ancient Egypt. There's a very clear lineage of that story that goes way, 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 way back. And it's a very simple story. It's about a sorcerer who has an apprentice, and the apprentice is just kind of learning the ropes. And one day the sorcerer goes out, runs some errands, leaves his apprentice in charge of the sorcerer's workshop, the lab. And the apprentice thinks, hey, I'm ready to handle all these hidden powers. I'm ready to tinker with these mythic powers. It's my turn, And without any real anchor, without any real training, without any real guidance, he starts tinkering with things that he ultimately can't control. And, Pandora's box opens, so to speak, and he unleashes like waves of water and brooms and buckets in this underground workshop. And the whole place is going to be flooded, and he can't figure out how to put the mess back together after he's unleashed it. And so he's in real trouble. And, and in the story, the sorcerer comes back at the last minute and kind of saves the day and everything like that, and some versions of the story, right? And, it's a simple story, and I almost didn't use it because of its simplicity. It's like, oh, that's obvious, AI, the sorcerer's apprentice, right? But I ended up using it because in its simplicity, to me, it encapsulates a whole lot about the current AI issue and how we're approaching it, and what you could call the loss of mastery and initiation, and the human propensity for tinkering with powers that we can't control, and the consequences of thinking we're ready to handle something before we actually are. All of these dynamics are incredibly present in the story. And so finally, to me, it seemed like, oh, this is the obvious story to tell. This is the story to tell.
Yeah, I think it also exemplifies something that is often referred to in the AI risk community as perverse instantiation, like in the paperclip maximizer analogy, where your goal is to create paperclips and you end up devoting all the world's resources towards making paperclips, like Mickey's goal of animating a broom to wash the floor, and you end up with hundreds of brooms and a flooded workshop. In your episode on this, you said it more than once, that allegories like the sorcerer's apprentice are no longer metaphors. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean that we are actually messing with potentially world-altering powers, not in an allegorical sense, but in an actual sense. Basically, like the powers of the ancient myths, the powers that we used to assume were fantasy stories, right? The powers of ancient sorcerers and the powers of ancient magicians. These are real when you talk about AI. So in other words, if I have a technology at my disposal that allows me to deceive a billion people at once, that is the stuff of storybooks. That is the stuff of myth and legend. And that's why I say that we have to look to the myths for guidance in how to act in this time, because it's really the only corollary that we have. In other words, you can talk all you want about kind of, oh, let's, slap some regulations on this and this kind of thing. And you can say, well, this is all kind of progressing rationally or according to market forces. And actually what we're talking about, when we really talk about it, we're talking about magic powers. We're talking about what, for all intents and purposes, are magic powers. And it doesn't matter if there's like we can explain how they happen. That's not the point, right? It's still magic in that it involves the massive manipulation of reality, right? Manipulation of reality on a massive scale. So when you start talking about the fact that, global elections could be thrown because of AI, or the entire system of online identity verification, or I might get a phone call from someone tomorrow speaking to me in your voice asking me for some personal details, and I'm actually having a conversation with them. It's not just a pre-recorded thing. And I have no idea whatsoever that it's not you. This is illusion. This is magic, right? And so when we understand that there's like world altering magic at play in this stuff, then it opens up a different way of looking at it and a different, portal through which I think we can gain some wisdom around how to deal with it. And that has to do with how have people historically treated powers? How have people culturally built in safeguards to manage what you could call world altering powers? And traditional cultures and traditional myths have a lot to teach us about this. They have a lot to say about what you do with the person who wants to tinker with the fabric of reality.
Because you talk about that as well in the episode. You talk about the need for containers as part of the initiatory process. And that, again, speaks to another line of language that's used in the AI community, which is the containment problem. And, years ago when I had started to read about this stuff, where it was mostly philosophical by people like Nick Bostrom and others, these concerns were sort of at top of mind. You had guys like Elon Musk who openly mused about them on panels. And it seems like now that this stuff is being increasingly commercialized and it's been shown to have efficacy in practical use cases, those concerns, while they continue to be voiced, and many people that work in AI, including some of the founders of the technology, have voiced them, while that's true, that it seems to be moving forward faster than ever, and it's justified for a variety of reasons, including geopolitical competition and the need to get there first before the other people do. What do you attribute this to? This, I would say even you could argue recklessness with this technology that has been described like, similarly to nuclear weapons or fire in terms of its creative and destructive capabilities. What's driving this urgency in your view?
Well, I think that all of those larger statements about, there's international competition around this, and, we can't let our shareholders down, and we have to achieve general intelligence by XX a date, all of that's language around what you could call a deep underlying agitated energetic. In other words, like underneath all that is the relentless forward movement of progress that human beings have gotten caught in, really. And it's more than just a narrative. It's an actual addiction. We're addicted to relentless forward progress. And so it's like, oh yeah, there are concerns and considerations, but we got to move forward. That's what we do. We move forward. We get things to market. We beat our competition. That's a agitation. And when you see really what can only be called bizarre statements about the search for general intelligence and this kind of thing, you understand that, there are deeper agitations going on within psyches. There's a deeper drive happening around all this stuff than just the ostensibly this is the way that capitalism works, and we just kind of, we get stuff out there because that's what we do. It relates to what I call in the episode chthonic, which means very deep, right? Underworld. Yeah, deep drives within the human being that have historically been recognized, and they've been tempered. And again, one of those drives is really deep set within the human being. And as some traditional cultures understand it, particularly in young men who happen to make up the majority of AI coders by far, the drive to mess with stuff and tinker with stuff and see what happens, right? And usually in the story, when the young apprentice starts messing with stuff and saying, hey, look what I can do. Look what I can do, everyone. I can create this roving intelligence that does this, and, I can splice this with this. And, that kind of agitated, relentless forward seeking that, wants to do something before its time, that wants to make its mark before its time. In traditional cultures and traditional storylines, that's tempered by the elder who then comes in and says, no, not yet. Right? I mean, that's the classic thing. And you see it in kung fu movies, and you see it in Star Wars, and you see it everywhere where the eager young apprentice, I mean, it's interesting, right? That in Star Wars even repetitively refers to Darth Vader as my young apprentice, right? Or to Luke as my young apprentice, right? It's like the young apprentice gets a vision of power and self-aggrandizement and even potentially like death and destruction, right? And then at some point, if you're studying with like a true elder or a true master, they come along and say, no, you're not ready for that. You have to go through an initiation process first. You have to learn what it means to be able to hold power first. You have to recognize in your body how anchored and tied you are to community first. You have to recognize that you're not special, right? All of these things are traditionally the function of initiation ritual in cultures. And instead, we celebrate that particular adolescent, like, ooh, look what I can do. We celebrate it, and venture capital pours billions of dollars at it. And container is everything. Like, container is everything. Everything needs to function within its appropriate container. And if the container hasn't been constructed, then there are consequences, right? So, I think it's important to recognize that there are deeper drives behind this. And one of the things I talk about in the episode too is, right, like we've been talking about how this is going to destroy us all for years, right? We've been talking about it for 100 years. In fact, the very first mention of the word robot is in a Czech play from 100 years ago where they talk about robots destroying humanity, right? So that's been part of the narrative this entire time. And if we have this narrative that it's going to destroy us all, and yet we're relentlessly moving towards it, you got to see that there's some other drive happening, and that gets into interesting territory. And, I'll say this now, and I'm not sure if you want to dive into it now, but part of the drive to create AI is what you could call a subconscious death drive. We are fascinated by the prospect of destruction, right? And this is very clearly an adolescent thing too, right? Adolescents at a certain phase are fascinated with destruction. And that's a signal to the elders that the time is right for initiation, right? The time is right to temper that fascination with destruction. When you live in a culture that rewards that adolescent vision, then, that death drive gets put like front and center. Yeah. So it's, important to look at the deeper drives behind this all.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's really exceptional about the way that you do these long monologues, it's not even fair to call them monologues there. And they operate, you've also said this in a previous interview, that what you do operates on a sound level too. It's on a level of resonance. It isn't just about the words. It's also about the intonation. It's about the sounds that you introduce. It seems that's another way of saying that there are many threads to pull on here. The thread about fathers and elders, and the thread about annihilation and our desire to tinker with things that could kill ourselves, or our fascination with doing things just to see, as you talked about in the example of scientists working on the nuclear bomb, was it because or on explosives? Was it because they were interested in the military use cases or the math behind it, or were they just really interested in seeing what happens when things blow up?
Yeah.
I feel like, and this is sort of my question, do you feel like the last 200 years especially has been a progression towards the unleashing of powers that we cannot control? That, in other words, like human beings embedded in nature can only do so much damage, and the damage they're going to do primarily to themselves. But as we've become more technologically sophisticated, we've been able to capture, harness, and apply power to both alleviate suffering, there's no question about it. We've done this with shelter, with food, with medicine, but also to cause immense amounts of suffering. We've done this through multiple wars, world wars, especially through the use of nuclear weapons, through nuclear meltdowns, most recently with Fukushima, which is an ongoing catastrophe. And so do you feel like AI is just the next progression in this sequence, and that there's something inherently unstable about human beings having access to so much power, and having access to so much power in such a decentralized manner, which is what AI is? It's more decentralized profusion of power than was the case with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, with nuclear weapons, you don't have the possibility of like a, home nuclear weapons kit where you can basically become your own personal nuclear power, thank God. Right. But with AI, like you're saying, it is decentralized. And if you're a really good coder, you could be off working on something that nobody has no idea what's being worked on right now and potentially unleash something that is, world altering. And that is something that I think the appropriate response to that is to be terrified of that, right? You don't just hand everybody nuclear weapons, and in the same light, handing people access to potentially world altering powers, I think, is terrifying. And what you're talking about, the role of technology in this, there are a lot of narratives that we hear about technology, and a lot of those narratives have to do with how it's going to save us all. And now they're like, oh, it's going to kill us all. Technology obviously can greatly assist the human life and can make certain things possible that weren't possible before, and has been instrumental in increasing human lifespan, for example, though that's been changing over the last few years too. And at the same time, I think we have to look at, in the myths, this is what you could call like the blessing and the curse of Prometheus. Prometheus gives the first technology to human beings, which is the technology of fire. And from that, Pandora's box is unleashed. And human beings, the name Prometheus means forward thinker. And so when I'm talking about that relentless, restless forward agitation, the relentless technological drive, there was a paper that came out recently, like a tech utopian manifesto. It came out right when I was at an AI conference in San Francisco, and it was basically like technology is going to take us from, living in huts to living on Mars. And, anyone who actually looks into like what it would be like to live on Mars, it sounds absolutely miserable to me. It's like no plant life. It's minus 40 below zero. So you have to start to think that it's not the actual destination that is addictive and appealing to human beings. It's the relentless forward drive, right? Mm. So, there are narratives about AI that say that all the problems in the world will be solved through this type of technological intelligence. It'll be able to solve, the climate crisis. It'll be able to solve global hunger, this type of thing. Well, human beings already know how to solve global hunger. We have the tools capable right now. Without AI, we have the tools capable to make this world a much better place, right? But what it comes down to is that human beings actually have to embody change within ourselves. We actually have to create the change within ourselves. We have to work with one another and do the difficult process of creating change. And if we don't want to do any of that inner work, then technology isn't going to save us. It's just going to be an amplification of all the existing problems that human beings already have.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That speaks to a number of things that you've highlighted in your shows. And it speaks specifically to the overarching sort of alignment problem in AI. And you talk about this both in terms of the disembodiment of modern society. This is something that I've talked about on the show too, and I was really happy to hear you talk about it. You talk about it as disembodied intelligence or global scale technologically induced autism, the spectrum magnified exponentially. But it also speaks to the fact that these systems are learning from a particular data set. Not only is it the same data set that you're talking about here, which is a whole of humanity, billions of people that haven't figured out how to reduce suffering and starvation for the people's most vulnerable, right? So it's a political values problem. It's actually not a technological problem. So it's learning its ethics from that cohort of information. But also it's learning from an even narrower set of information, which is the online representation. And we as human beings are increasingly living our lives in this disembodied way, increasingly online. And we're seeing, at the very least anecdotally, I've seen papers, but I've never looked into the methodology well enough to cite them. But we're seeing evidence of this in kids in terms of how they behave, in terms of the rise of certain antisocial behaviors. I mean, technology affects culture. So my question is, do you think that AI researchers who are working at the cutting edge and at the frontier of this technology, the ones pushing it forward, appreciate the intractability of the alignment problem, given what we're talking about, or are they susceptible to underestimating it, in part because they themselves are an example of the kind of Silicon Valley boyish thinking that you spoke about earlier and that you've talked about on your show?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are conversations that are happening about it, and I've been a part of a few of those conversations. So I think that there are technologists, for example, who are deeply looking at screen time right now, and then then the question becomes, okay, if it's not going to be screens, then what's it going to be? It's going to be like a voice in your head that speaks to you from the collar of your shirt or something like that and guides you throughout your day, which, then I can see very easily that there are going to be somatic repercussions to that. Like, we already have enough voices in our head. Who wants another voice in our head, right?
And one that we don't control necessarily. That's a huge aspect of this.
Absolutely. It's a massive aspect of this. Like, taking our attention over and over and over again for multiple hours a day to this kind of, glowing portal that we carry around in our pockets. Like, it's harnessing basic human capabilities, somatic capabilities of focus and the human tendency to focus in on luminous focal points. It's harnessing that for the primary purpose of keeping you somewhere as long as it can and making as much money off of you as it can, right? And the fact that we are willing to turn over agency to something that is ultimately being driven by, very base profit motives, like, I think that is an unsustainable situation. And I think that you see bodies rebelling against it. I've talked about how our ancestors would see us like hunched over phones, like our Paleolithic ancestors would see modern humans hunched over phones, and they wouldn't care who's like winning that argument on the internet, between those two people hunched over their phones. They just see two people that are like lost, their entire bodies bent around this, glowing rock. Like, what is wrong with those people, And I don't like to give the impression that I'm a Luddite. Like, I make use of technology. We're making use of technology right now. My podcast is obviously, very driven by audio recording technology and this type of thing. But specifically understanding that we may encounter very soon a scenario in which we have access to floods of intelligence, even more than we have now, floods of information, all the information in the universe at our disposal. And we might not be able to do a thing with it because we can't sit still for more than 5 minutes and pay attention.
Well, you say in the episode that, quote, perhaps this time it's the deluge of information that will take us out. And oh, how that flood of information will sweep bodies away by the thousands. How it already is. Bodies that can't handle it. Bodies that never knew they were under the spell of illusory magic all along. That line, sweep bodies away by the thousands, really resonated with me. Where are we seeing bodies being swept away right now?
Well, you just mentioned what's happening with kids, and there were just big congressional hearings in the United States on social media and kids and the effect that it's having on kids. I'm raising kids right now. They're, thank God, not yet of the age where I have to consider phones or no phones or that kind of thing. But this is a real thing. I'm looking around at friends who have older kids, and wow, you're seeing skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression within kids. You're seeing rates of vertigo now that they're attributing to so much like shifting luminous imagery on the phones. And to me, that suggests something deeper. It suggests that people are losing a basic anchor. It's like, before you've even developed a somatic anchor in the world, like before you've even developed a basic felt sense in your body of like, okay, this way is east, this way is west, this way is north, this way is south, with which, traditional ways of raising kids instills in you from a very young age. Before you've even developed that, you're just exposed to this cacophonous, uncentered flood of imagery. Of course, that's causing vertigo, dizziness. That dizziness is a symptom of a greater cultural dizziness. Our culture is profoundly dizzy at the moment, right? Has forgotten, I would say, which way is up and which way is down. which way is east and which way is west. So I think you're going to see that continue. When I used, some people question, why I said something like technology-induced autism, and I didn't make that up. There are studies that show, and first of all, I know plenty of autistic kids, and they have gifts and beautiful ways of seeing the world and incredible perceptions of the world. So it's not a knock on autism, but it's a recognition that there are studies that are showing that technology creates neurodivergence in children. And that's worth paying attention to. I think neurodivergence is something to celebrate, and it's always been with us. And at the same time, you can say, is the technology creating a lot of problems for future generations? And I think the answer is resoundingly yes.
Yeah, look, Josh, I don't even think you need to sort of contextualize your statement. We as adults are experiencing this. We as adults treat each other in more antisocial ways because of how we interact online. The idea that a young child that's developing at that stage is going to be much more affected, that's something that we all can understand because we've all grown up. We've experienced what it's like to do things at a young age and how we're better at them or become more adapted at them than other things. Let's talk about fathering, because this comes up in the context of protecting children. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. This has been something that I've talked about on the show as well. I think it's an unforgivable failure of our society, the failure to protect our children. It tells you a lot about our values and where they are, that this isn't a source of immediate consensus for everyone across the socioeconomic spectrum, irrespective of where we come from. You write in the episode that, quote, the story of tech initiates rapidly seeking to prove to the world that they can unlock hidden powers may also be a story about boys seeking fathers. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean.
It's pretty straightforward. Like I said, the vast majority of AI coders are male, and the particular energetic, again, and when I say energetic, I mean, you could say behavioral pattern or tendency, the particular energetic of young boys saying, look what I can do, world, look what I can do. Traditionally, that's kind of a cry out to the father to say, yes, that's beautiful, son. And maybe not yet. Maybe you need to grow into that a little bit more. And here's how I, as a father, am going to hold gentle, loving space for you to grow in the pace that you need to grow. And I'm not going to tell you you're ready before you're ready. And I'm going to be firm with you when it comes to that. I'm going to say it's not time for that yet. You haven't quite gotten to the point where, you can do that on your own. In the absence of that, I think as a culture, in a way, as a modern civilization, are running around trying to prove something. We're trying to show, look what we can do, look what we can do, look what we can do. And every time my child is testing the boundaries, every time I've seen him, he's about to turn 5. Every time he's testing the boundaries, what I can really see is that he's asking for my loving, guiding attention. And loving doesn't mean just letting him do what he wants to do. Loving means guiding too, right? It means both of these things. It means, so when he's testing the boundaries, when he knows something's a boundary and he's just let's just see what happens if I cross this boundary, he's asking for me to be there for him. And he's even asking for me to correct him and say no. Ultimately, he wants to see what the boundaries of existence are. When I say that humanity is in an adolescent phase, and I didn't make this up, there's a brilliant Aboriginal author named Tyson Yunkaporta who said this, he said, I look at modern culture and I see an adolescent phase. I think we're testing the boundaries and trying to prove that we can do stuff. And ultimately, whether we know it or not, we are asking to be reined in a bit. And I think that we will be reined in.
Put in our place.
Yeah, to be put in our place. And nature will put us in our place because that's what nature does ultimately. Ultimately, there are responses to action, right? And nature responds over the long haul. And, when you have too many kids who can't even function because they're spending so much screen time, then that will become an unsustainable situation and it will self-correct in one way or the other.
So I want to pull a few quotes again from the episode. One, just to speak to what you just talked about, and then one to lead us into a deepening part of the conversation about fatherhood and father energy and law and order. Again, this is another manifestation of it, the desire for law and order. But to your first point about your son, you wrote, quote, "When all else fails, when my son fails to get my attention or to receive the guiding, loving attention that I know he's longing for, what does he do? He knocks the whole blockhouse down. Is that where we're headed? Shall the entire house go under? All because we had something to prove?" That, like so much else, deeply resonates with me. I feel like in some sense, Josh, we are living through a period where that kind of destructive energy is coming out of people. I see it electorally, politically in our country. There's a kind of frustration, a desire to burn it all down, burn it the F down, So I want people to just kind of sit with that. And then I want to quote something else, which you partly mentioned it earlier in the conversation, but I want to reiterate it now or restate it in the context of our conversation about fatherhood. You wrote, "We desperately, thonically want to cede the authority of the self-proclaimed Anthropocene to greater powers. Because, quote, to live in a world of knowledge without limits, without context, without guidance, without the true mage in the room, doing whatever we want, whenever we want, is killing us." Do you feel like, because I feel this in a way, I don't know how to quite describe it, but again, your podcast sort of conveyed it in a way for me. I feel this sense of like, it's too much. This is too much power. There's too much of ability to act, to do things, to move things, to break things, and not enough context. It's like the container that you talk about. It's like something is missing. And it's almost like this kind of power that we have today as human beings is so overwhelming that there's like almost like a subconscious desire to unburden ourselves of it. And that sort of seems to dovetail with this desire for a father, for this fathering energy. Like I think, another great myth is the story of Odysseus and what happened to Ithaca when the men went to war, when the men went to Troy. What happened? The boys grew up and became suitors and they overran the castle. And Odysseus had to come back home. He had to string the bow. And he had to kill the suitors to set things right, to put order back in the home. And it feels like that's where we are today. And it feels like that's what we're seeing with respect to the rise of authoritarian forces, quote, strong men in the world. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the story of modernity is the story of human beings saying, hey, look, there's no higher power. We get to do whatever we want. And, now I think we're finding out that human beings left, unanchored from context, just doing whatever we want isn't a recipe for happiness either. I mean, I think that ultimately we long to live in a world of higher powers. We'll create those higher powers, like we'll create an AI that is more powerful than us in the absence of it, because ultimately we are living in a world of higher powers. We're living in a world in which we don't call all the shots. And I think that because we've lost touch with that, we're wandering around aimless. And I see what you're saying, the rise of the strongman figure, as an attempt to kind of, someone in this place has to at least be able to tell me what's going on and point me in the right direction and the right way to do things. And then unfortunately, those strongmen figures probably didn't have such good daddy relationships themselves and are not examples of what ultimately I think human beings are looking for. And ultimately that is, an understanding that there are greater powers beyond our control that we need to live in good relationship with, and that we don't call all the shots, and we have to, re-find a deeper connection with a world of larger forces.
Yeah, and I think in the United States, the allegory, to your point, it's not an allegory anymore. It's not a myth. Joe Biden embodies the old order, the old dying order. And what is there to replace it is not – there's a lot of darkness there. There's a lot of dark energy surrounding it. I want to move us to the second hour of this conversation, Josh, and I want to talk more specifically about what this world we're building with these technologies is becoming and what we are becoming in the process. Because one of the important trends of the last several decades has been the accelerating surrender of human decision-making to machines. We do this, for example, with how we decide what media and information to consume. And it feels like we're moving toward a post-enlightenment or post-scientific world that more closely resembles the pre-scientific era, where people consulted oracles and fortune tellers in order to make important decisions about their lives. And I feel like it's also showing up in a kind of mass hysteria and in people's willingness to believe in all sorts of things. This is not to say that official narratives are to be believed necessarily or in general, but what seems to be happening is a general unmooring from reality. And this was not the case last time humanity was playing with fire, with a new, potentially destructive technology during the early years of the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. And that technology was controlled by government in the national interest and not by commercial actors like it is today. So that's something that I would like to explore with you. I also want to talk about what it looks like to reclaim the initiatory process and what we can do as a society to steer the vector toward a potentially more positive outcome. Or is your view that we're so far gone that something catastrophic has to happen in order to create the conditions through which apprenticing and containment can occur? For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Josh, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Josh, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.
Great.
If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.